The black waitress looks like she doesn't understand anything. Good. I don't want to be overheard tonight.
She doesn't understand a word.
Mr. Spears, would you like me to inform management that your conversation requires privacy? Or would you prefer I continue as though I haven't understood a word you've said?
She.
Mr. Spears, I see you've met Adizi. Allow me to introduce her properly. She is fluent in German, French, Spanish, and Japanese. She is the daughter of Ellis Wells, former senior interpreter at the United Nations. She has been accepted to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And in 2 years on this floor...
And the night Conrad Spears decided Adizi Wells didn't understand anything was the night she saved 1,400 families from losing their pensions. He just didn't know that yet. Neither did she. But that night was still 3 days away. And right now. And Adizi was on the 11 and 47 southbound and pressed against the window and watching Chicago go past in pieces, and a gas station, a laundromat still open, yellow light pooling on the wet sidewalk, a man being walked by a dog that had somewhere to be and wasn't slowing down for anyone, and she hadn't opened the granola bar in her hand yet. She just held it. The way you hold something when your hands need something to do, and your head is somewhere else entirely. Her right thumb kept drifting to her apron pocket, just checking. The pin was still there. Small, gold, and shaped like an olive branch, which sounds prettier than it looks, but somehow manages to look exactly as pretty as it sounds. Her father had worn it on the lapel of every suit jacket he owned for 11 years, and she had worn it in her apron pocket for 2. Not on her lapel, in her pocket. Because there was a difference between carrying something and showing it, and Adizi had spent 2 years learning exactly how much of herself she could carry without showing any of it at all, and she was good at it now. Maybe too good. The letter was in her wallet, had been there for 26 months, folded into eighths, tucked behind her library card, in the slot where most people kept coffee loyalty cards, and Adizi didn't drink coffee. Didn't have loyalty cards. She had this. Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Master's program in conference interpretation, full tuition, a stipend, a start date that had come and gone 2 years ago without her. She hadn't read it in months, and didn't need to. She had it memorized the way you memorize something you're trying to forget involuntarily completely, at the worst possible moments. Like right now. The bus lurched through a yellow light. The man with the dog was gone, and the laundromat too. Just highway median now, and the long dark stretch between exits. She finally opened the granola bar, chewed, stared out the window, didn't think about the letter, thought about the letter, and her father used to say that language was the last thing people gave up. Ellis Wells had spent 19 years as a senior interpreter at the United Nations Office of Interpretation in New York. Before that, Geneva, and before that, and a kid from the south side of Chicago who'd taught himself 4 languages from library books, because he couldn't afford anything else, and because something about the architecture of how different minds moved through meaning felt, to him, and like breathing. And he was not a famous man. Nobody knew his name. That was the point, he always said. The best interpreters were invisible. You sat behind glass. You wore the headset. You disappeared into the space between what person said and what another person needed to hear. And you were the bridge, not the river, not the shore, just the bridge. He taught Adizi the same way he'd taught himself. Not with textbooks, though those came later. First it was pointing, and pointing at the woman at the grocery store checkout and whispering, "She's counting in Portuguese. Hear how she pauses before the tens." Pointing at the news anchor and saying, "That's a Southern accent sitting on top of a Midwestern one." And somebody worked hard to lose something they're not sure they wanted to lose. Always listening. Always past the surface. Listen all the way to the end of the sentence, baby. People hide who they are in the part they think you won't hear. And Adizi had been 9 years old the first time he said that. She was 26 now, sitting on a bus with 4 languages in her head, and a letter she'd never answered, and she still heard his voice say it in the middle of otherwise quiet moments, and she just wasn't always sure what to do with what she heard. Ellis Wells died on a Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. The way that cancer tends to be fast terribly, without the long stretch of time that lets you believe you might still get a different ending, and he was 51 years old. Adizi was 21. 3 weeks from moving into student housing at Middlebury. She had a packing list on her phone, and she had bought new bed sheets blue with white stripes. clearance bin at Target, because even full scholarships didn't come with furniture. She never used them. She put them in a box in the back of her closet, still in the plastic wrap, and the medical bills arrived while she was still choosing what to put on the headstone. And not the final bills, those came later, and then later still, and then once more, and from departments of the hospital she hadn't known existed, and collections letters, payment plans, phone calls from numbers she learned to recognize and stop answering. Yvonne Wells had worked nights at Chicago General for 18 years, good nurse, and the kind other nurses asked for advice, the kind attending physicians actually listened to, which was not a small thing, and she made a salary that was real and not, as it turned out, designed for the arithmetic that arrives when a 51-year-old man gets sick fast and dies faster. And so Adeze made a calculation, quietly, the way she did most things. She called Middlebury on a Wednesday morning, standing in the kitchen while her mother slept after a night shift. She was polite, she was precise, and she explained her situation without over-explaining it, which is harder than it sounds. The woman on the other end was kind, said she could defer, said the scholarship would hold, said to call back when she was ready. Adeze said she would. She hung up, and she applied for the waitressing job at the Harlow Room the following Monday. And she never told her mother. Not about the deferral, not about the scholarship, not about the bed sheets in the closet. And Yvonne knew Adeze had gotten in, had cried when the letter arrived, the real kind of crying, with hands over the mouth and shaking shoulders, had called Ellis's sister in Atlanta, had made jollof rice because that was what Yvonne made when something mattered, but she didn't know about the phone call, and nobody did. Some sacrifices happen in a single moment, one door closing, but some of them happen quietly, over and over, every morning when you set the alarm, every night when you tie the apron, and every time someone hands you a glass to refill and doesn't look at your face while you fill it. That was the kind Adeze had been making. For 2 years, the Harlow Room was the kind of restaurant that made you feel like you'd arrived somewhere, and not flashy somewhere, not loud somewhere. The other kind, dark wood and low light and tablecloths that were actually white, not the slightly off-white of places trying. The wine list ran 11 pages, the menu changed with the season, and there was a maitre who had been standing at the same host stand for 26 years, and had opinions about everything, and shared them with almost no one. His name was Horace Fitch, 55, silver at the temples, and posture like a man who'd been told to stand up straight at 14 and had never stopped. And he wore the same style of dark suit jacket every night, and pockets square, folded with the precision of someone who had decided, and at some point in his life, and that controlling the external details of a thing was the same as controlling the thing. And Adeze had worked for him for 2 years. He had told her to stay in her station so many times she'd stopped counting somewhere around month 4. She didn't hate Horace Fitch. She understood him, which was almost worse. And he was a man who had built his sense of himself out of the floor he controlled. And in what he controlled was these tables, and this service, and this carefully maintained illusion of seamlessness that required in his bones, and maybe that everyone stay exactly where he'd put them. And not because he was cruel, because he's afraid, and because if the hierarchy shifted, and even once, and even slightly, and the whole architecture of what he'd spent 26 years building might turn out to be something other than what he thought. And she heard it in the pauses when he spoke, in the flatness of his voice when he said, "Stay in your station," please the please that wasn't a please, just a courtesy syllable attached to a command. She obeyed, not because she agreed, and because the dinner always mattered more than the argument, and she was very good at keeping those two things separate. Eleanor Osei had built the Harlow Room from a coffee cart, not a metaphor, and in 1996, and she had operated an actual coffee cart on the corner of Michigan and Erie, and 6 days a week, and for 3 years, and before she had enough to lease the space that would become what it was now. And 30 years later, she was 62, and she still arrived before the kitchen staff and left after the last person clocked out. She was a small woman, quiet voice, the kind of quiet that isn't soft refined down to something precise, and she noticed everything and commented on almost nothing. Her ledger had a column of notes in handwriting so small, it looked like punctuation marks having a disagreement. She had written Adeze's name in that ledger 3 times in 2 years, and not for mistakes. The first time was a Tuesday in October, about 4 months in. Adize's had been on her break. Not a real break, the kind that was 15 minutes of being vertical in a hallway that wasn't the dining room. And she was sitting on a folding chair with a textbook balanced on her knee, not a restaurant manual, not anything related to the job, and the Journal of Language and Diplomacy, folded into quarters, the kind of publication that had no business being in the apron pocket of a woman who was about to go refill bread baskets. And she was reading it the way you read something you've been waiting all day to get back to. Eleanor had come out of the back office for something and stopped in the doorway. She watched for maybe 4 seconds. Then she went back to her office, opened her ledger, and wrote one word, and Adize. That same evening, a party of 5 was seated at table 9. Their dietary cards were written partly in French dual citizenship, scribbled before traveling, no thought given to translation, and the Asen server, a pleasant young man named Davis who was good at his job, looked at those cards the way you look at a bill for something you didn't order. He stood there for 4 seconds, holding the cards, going slightly pale. Adize was passing with a tray. She stopped and looked at the cards, looked at Davis, and said nothing, just took them, and circled the key restrictions, and wrote the French terms translated in pencil in the margin, and handed them back, and kept walking. And Davis said quietly, "Thank you." She was already around the corner. Horace had seen it from the host stand, and he waited until she passed him on the way back to her section, and said, and without raising his voice, "And stay in your lane, please. And that's Davis's table." She nodded, walked back to her section. 2 minutes later, Adele Marsh passed her in the corridor near the wine room, and Adele was 50, had worked at Harlow for 22 years, and had the bearing of someone who had seen enough of the world to find very little of it surprising anymore. And she paused when she reached Adize, said, quietly, "Your father would have ordered the Riesling tonight, just so you know," then kept walking. Adize stood still for a moment. Her hand drifted to her apron pocket, and pressed against the fabric until she felt the small, hard shape underneath. Then she went back to work. The second time Eleanor wrote her name was in January, a private dinner, 40 guests, and a birthday celebration for a woman turning 70, who had spent significant portions of her life in France and had preferences about how celebrations should feel, and which meant French service, which meant the staff needed to navigate a conversation about the menu without reaching for their phones under the tablecloth. Most of them could not. And the assigned lead server spent the evening drifting toward Adize between courses with increasingly panicked eyes. She didn't take over. That wasn't her table. But she translated, quietly, when the birthday woman's daughter pulled the wrong server aside to split a dietary change. She adjusted, without drama, a wine recommendation that had been offered based on a misheard preference. And she did this while moving between her own tables, without pausing, without drawing attention. Eleanor was at the host stand the entire evening. She went back to her office, opened the ledger, wrote Adize's name again, and next to it, a single note, watching. And the third time was the Brenner dinner. This one mattered in a different way. 3 days before the Spears booking, Horace pulled Eleanor aside, and the Harlow room had been reserved for a private business dinner, 12 guests, from a logistics firm, all full senior leadership, in town for an acquisition. And the kind of table that didn't just eat dinner but evaluated you. The assigned server was a man named Hugh, 9 years on the floor, exactly right for a table like this. Hugh called 90 minutes before service, stomach flu, couldn't stand up. Horace started reshuffling the floor, like a man doing arithmetic with numbers that wouldn't cooperate. He went through the available staff the way a chess player stares at a board that's suddenly run out of pieces. 3 servers on the floor, and 2 relatively new. The third was Adize, but he didn't finish the thought out loud. Eleanor came out of her office, stood next to him, looked at the board, said, "Who do we have?" He listed the floor, did not list Adize. And Adele Marsh was at the bar uncorking something. Not looking up, she said, "Put Adize on it." Horace's jaw went tight. "She's not ready for something this size, Eleanor." Eleanor looked at Adele. Adele nodded once. Eleanor said, "Tonight she is." And Horace walked Adize through the table assignments with the thoroughness of a man explaining fire safety to someone he didn't trust to remember any of it. He covered which fork went where, the wine pairings for each course, and which guest was most important, and how to make him feel it without making the others feel they weren't. He spoke to her like she was on her third shift. She nodded through all of it. She didn't correct him. She ate every word. And because the dinner mattered more than being right, and she had known which fork went where since she was 14, when her father had made her practice table settings in their apartment kitchen using mismatched silverware and a dish towel for a tablecloth, and service started at 7:30. By 7:45, the table was running. By 8, the wine was ahead of schedule, and at 8:15, and the German CFO heavy man and wire-framed glasses, and the distracted look of someone whose mind ran a few minutes ahead of his mouth, leaned toward his colleague and said, and in conversational German, and that he was allergic to fennel and hoped the kitchen had taken his written notes seriously, and the kitchen had not. The next course was a lamb dish with a fennel pollen crust. Adeze was 3 feet away, placing a water glass at the neighboring chair. She heard every word. She didn't stop, didn't look at him, didn't change her pace. She finished placing the glass and crossed the room and intercepted the runner at the kitchen pass next course and the lamb. And CFO at seat 3, pull it, an off-menu substitute. And now, and the kitchen moved, and 38 seconds. And the CFO never saw it. He received a different plate. He ate. He had a lovely evening. That was what mastery looked like in a dining room. Not the flourish, not the announcement. The kind that looked, from the outside, like nothing had happened at all, and the dinner ended at 10:40. The firm's CEO, tall, white-haired, the quiet steadiness of a man who had stopped performing for rooms a long time ago, found Eleanor before he left. In the middle of the floor, and in front of the remaining staff, he said, "Where did you find her? She's exceptional." Eleanor didn't blink, the smallest smile, the knowing kind. She found us. Horace was at the bar, cloth moving in circles over the mahogany. He heard every word. His hands kept moving, but his jaw locked in a way that Adele, watching from the wine room entrance, noticed immediately. She had seen that look before, on other men, in other rooms. It wasn't the look of someone angry at a failure, and it was the look of someone angry at a success they hadn't authorized. Not because Adeze had done anything wrong, because she'd done something right without needing his permission to do it. And in Horace Fitch's internal accounting, those two things had always been the same. And Adeze went home that night with $240 in tips folded into her apron pocket. She put the money on the kitchen counter when she got in. Her mother was asleep, and the apartment was dark and smelled like the rosemary Yvonne kept in a small pot by the sink, slightly overwatered, stubbornly alive. She made a sandwich, sat at the table, thought about a CFO who didn't know she'd saved his evening, about a CEO's voice saying exceptional to the wrong person, about Horace's jaw at the bar. She read 2 chapters of a conference interpretation textbook library copy, spine cracked from other people's hands, and went to bed at 12:50, and smallest victory of her life. And the maitre at the bar had already, very quietly, decided it would also be her last. The staff schedule board lived in the back corridor, between the coat hooks and the supply cabinet that never closed properly. Adeze saw it Thursday morning, and she'd come in early habit, not a requirement. Knowing the floor in advance meant thinking ahead. That was the only way she knew how to do anything. She found her name at the bottom, and water service, pre-busing, main floor, no tables, no section, nothing beyond the shared tip pool. She would be in the room for the most significant reservation of the Harlow year, and she would carry the pitcher and clear the bread plates, and she would not exist to the people at those tables. The reservation in question was the Spears dinner. Conrad Spears, CEO of Spears International, and in Chicago to close the acquisition of Daltrey Manufacturing, a Midwest employer, 3 factories, 1,400 workers, and the signing was scheduled for Saturday morning. Friday night was the dinner. The Harlow room was where Conrad Spears ate when he wanted the evening to be a statement. She read the reservation notes. Mr. Spears prefers German for staff interaction when available, and she read that line twice. Then she looked at her assignment again, water service. She took her apron off the hook, folded it over her arm, walked toward the locker room. She turned the corner past the supply shelf, the one with empty boxes no one ever threw away, and stopped, and 2 voices. She knew them both. Newer servers, the kind of new that still thought this place had sides. She heard her own name. She didn't move, didn't announce herself, stood in the next row of lockers, 6 feet away, and listened. Been kissing up to Mrs. Osei for months, and that's the only reason she got the Brenner table. The German thing? My cousin works at a place on the Gold Coast. Half those corporate clients speak English just fine, and she didn't do anything that special. Exactly. She's just good at making people think she did. Adeze stood still. She finished folding her spare shirt, which she'd been holding this entire time, and put it in her bag. She picked up her coat, and she walked past them on her way to the door. "Have a good shift," she said. Neither of them answered. She went home. The bus that afternoon felt longer than the distance justified, and she sat in the window seat, and the city did something it occasionally did, where instead of sliding past it, sort of stared back, and all the lit windows in all those buildings were full of other people's warmth, and she was on the outside of the glass. And she pulled her wallet out, found the slot behind the library card, took the letter out. It was soft at the fold lines now. Worn thin the way paper gets when it's been handled too many times without being read. She unfolded it. The Middlebury letterhead, the date, and the formal language of institutional welcome, still legible. "We are pleased to offer you admission." The start date was 2 Septembers ago. She thought about throwing it away, sat with that thought for a long time, and long enough that 2 teenagers got on at the next stop. A woman with a stroller shifted positions twice. The driver changed the radio once. She didn't throw it away, folded it back into eighths, tucked it behind her library card, looked out the window, and Yvonne was home when Adeze got there. That was wrong. Yvonne worked nights, had for 18 years. The apartment should have been dark, kitchen's cold, the only trace of her mother, the coffee mug, drying by the sink and the second pair of shoes in the entryway. And instead, light under the kitchen door. Adeze pushed it open. Her mother was sitting at the table in the blue terry cloth robe, the one washed so many times the pile had become more suggestion than texture. 2 mugs on the table, both cold. "They sent me home early," Yvonne said, "and staffing thing. Come sit down." Adeze sat. She didn't say what happened. Her mother hadn't asked. They'd always been like that, less about saying and more about the quality of the silence between. And for a full minute, the only sound was the refrigerator. Then Yvonne picked up her cold mug, held it without drinking. "Your father told me something," she said. "The last week, he couldn't eat anymore. We were sitting right here at this table. He was holding my hand." She paused and took one sip of the cold coffee. "Set it down," he said. "The people who don't see you, they're practicing. For the day somebody forces them to. Don't help them practice." And she looked at Adeze. I didn't understand it then. I do now. She reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with both of hers. "I don't know what's happening at that restaurant. You don't tell me. That's fine. But I see your face when you come home, baby. I see it, and I'm just telling you what your father told me. Don't help them practice." Adeze looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of it, the old coffee ring that had been there since she was 7 and had never fully come out, and the small pot of rosemary on the windowsill still alive, despite everything. She put her face in her hands, and she cried, not loudly, not long, about 90 seconds. And the kind of crying that isn't grief and isn't self-pity, but is the release of a pressure that's been building so slowly, forgot it was building at all. Until suddenly, it's right there at the surface, and the only thing to do is let it out before it turns into something harder. And then she stopped, wiped her face with a napkin from the holder on the table, drank the cold coffee, because her mother had made it, and it was there, and some things you just do. She got up, kissed her mother's forehead, and felt the warmth of her, the solidness, the particular smell of hospital soap and shea butter, and something underneath both that was just Yvonne. "Good night, Mama. Good night, baby." She went to bed. She lay in the dark with the fan on, and her phone face down, and Chicago outside doing its city things. A horn somewhere, a dog briefly. The vibration of a bus going past without stopping. She thought about her father. She thought about what he'd told her mother at a kitchen table in a robe he would never take off again. And she thought about the Spears dinner, 3 days away. Her name at the bottom of the board, water service. She picked up her phone, not to call anyone, not to text, just to look. And she searched. Spears International, annual revenue, active acquisitions. A press release about the pending Daltrey purchase. Indiana, major Midwest employer, signing expected within the week. She found the investor materials, the acquisition prospectus, and both the English version and 2 clicks deeper into the subsidiary filings, the German language version prepared for their European financing partners. She downloaded both, set her phone on the nightstand, closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a while, but when she opened the documents an hour later and started reading, really reading, the way her father had taught her, with both versions side by side and a pencil for the margins, she understood why. And because on page 41 of the German version, there was a clause, and there was no equivalent clause on page 41 of the English version, or any other page. She read it twice, slowly, then once more, faster, to make sure she wasn't misreading the construction. And German legal language had its specific traps, passive constructions that buried the subject, compound nouns that collapsed complex obligations into a single term, conditional phrasing that looked like a standard provision until you noticed what the condition actually was, and she wasn't misreading it. And she got up and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, and then stood at the sink looking out at the courtyard, and a light was on in the apartment across the way. Someone else not sleeping. She went back, read the clause a fourth time. Then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote down the key terms in English, then the German original next to each one, and then in a third column, what those terms actually meant when you put them together in that order. And 1,400 families. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. Next to the pin, she set her alarm for 7. She went to bed. And then this time she slept, because she knew something now that she hadn't known at 11 o'clock, and knowing it changed the weight of what the next 3 days were supposed to be. She wasn't just on water service. She was exactly where she needed to be. 3 days passed, and she worked her shifts, and poured the water, cleared the plates, moved through the room at exactly the speed the room required, visible only as much as the job required. A woman doing her job in a space that had decided she had a ceiling and wasn't watching for the moment she'd stop respecting it. And she watched. She listened. She always listened. And she kept the folded paper in her apron pocket. And she kept the pin in the same pocket. And she did not take either of them out until Friday night. And when Conrad Spears walked into the Harlow room and sat down at table 6 and looked up at the woman filling his water glass for less than a second before deciding she understood nothing. And he was wrong. He was about to find out how wrong. But that part comes next. The Spears dinner was a Friday, and Daisy knew this, the way she knew most things about the Harlow room, not because anyone told her directly, but because she had been paying attention for 2 years, and attention had a way of filling in the gaps that no one bothered to explain. And she arrived 40 minutes before her shift. Not because water service required 40 minutes of preparation, and it didn't. You picked up the pitcher. You filled it. You moved through the room without spilling anything and without existing any more than the moment required. She arrived early because she wanted to see the setup, the table configuration, and where Horace had positioned the primary seating, which direction the sightlines ran from table 6, and which corners of the room sat in the blind spots that people at important tables tended to forget about. And she stood in the dining room for 3 minutes before anyone noticed her. And Eleanor noticed her, and from across the room, and the older woman looked up from the reservation book, and looked at Adaise, and looked at the room, and then looked back at Adaise, and said nothing. Went back to the book. That was as enough. At 6:45, Horace gathered the floor staff in the back corridor. He was precise, thorough, and he went through the evening's timeline with the focus of a man who believed that if you controlled the details hard enough, nothing unexpected could happen. And he did not look at Adaise once during the briefing. She stood at the back and listened and memorized the seating chart he was holding, even though she wouldn't be using it. Conrad Spears, party of 4. Table 6, corner, lake view, and the best table in the room, the one Eleanor reserved for people who would notice which table they'd been given. Spears would arrive at 7:30. He preferred not to be kept waiting. The kitchen had been briefed on a shellfish allergy for one of his guests, and standard. Nothing she didn't already know. She picked up her pitcher at 7:15 and took her position. They arrived at 7:28, 4 of them. Conrad Spears at the front, 64 years old, silver-haired in the way certain men wore silver hair like a credential, and tall. The posture of someone accustomed to entering rooms and having them rearranged slightly around him. He wore a dark suit and the expression of a man for whom this particular dinner was, at best, a pleasant obligation before the real work tomorrow morning. And behind him, 2 colleagues whose names Adaise didn't know and wouldn't need tonight. and at Spears's left, one step back, a man she recognized from the investor documents, Chief Financial Officer. His name was Aldrich Voss. 52, compact build, and eyes that moved around a room the way an accountant moved through numbers, not curious, just tallying. He was the one who had drafted Clause 44, and she had figured that out from the document metadata, from the version history, from the legal phrasing, matched a memo she'd found in a subsidiary filing 3 years prior, bearing his initials in the revision log, and she didn't let that show on her face. She was good at that. Horace seated them with the efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Menace appeared. Adele materialized at tableside to discuss wine. The room settled into its rhythm. A daisy moved, and table 2 water refill left side, don't linger. Table 7 clear the bread basket, replace with fresh. Table 6 initial pour. She approached from the left, standard, and pitcher in her right hand, left hand flat against the small of her back, the way she'd been taught in her first week and hadn't forgotten. And Spears was talking, not to his colleagues, not about the menu, and he was mid-sentence when she arrived, and the sentence was in German, and it was the German people use when they believe they are in a private conversation in a public space, when they've decided that everyone around them is furniture. She poured Voss's water first, and he didn't look up. She moved to the colleague on the right. Spears kept talking, and his German was fluent and colloquial, and she caught every word without trying, and the way she caught music from a window 3 floors up passively, and completely, and the sound arriving and being understood before she'd decided to understand it. And he was talking about the room. Fine, he said. Acceptable. About Chicago. Cold, he said. Always cold. And then he glanced up, just a moment, less than a second. The glance you give a piece of furniture when you want to confirm it hasn't moved. He looked at a daisy, and then he looked back at Voss and said, and in German, and in the easy tone of a man who had never once considered that the furniture might have opinions, and the black waitress looks like she doesn't understand anything. And good. I don't want to be overheard tonight. Voss smiled. The 2 colleagues shifted. One looked at his menu. The other looked at his hands. Neither said anything. A daze poured Spears's water. Steady, even, and exactly the right level, not too full, because a too full glass was a spill waiting for a busy's moment to make it happen. She had been pouring water glasses for 2 years and had never spilled one. She set the pitcher down on the tablecloth and straightened the napkin she had repositioned on arrival. And when she reached into her apron pocket, not thinking, just the habitual check she'd made 1,000 times, her fingers caught the pin wrong. It slipped, and then before she could correct for it, the gold olive branch dropped from her pocket and landed on the white tablecloth with a small, precise sound. 6 inches from Spears's bread plate. He looked down and looked at it the way you look at something that has interrupted your thoughts for a half second. And without recognition, without interest, he looked away. A daisy reached for it, and in the half second between the pin landing and her fingers closing around it, something shifted, not in the room, in her. She couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't even the weight of being spoken about like a lamp in a room she was standing in. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was her father's voice at a kitchen table, and it was 2 years of granola bars in back hallways, and a folded letter going soft at the creases, and a name at the bottom of a schedule board. It was the CFO who had eaten dinner safely because she'd been paying attention. It was the word exceptional spoken to the wrong person, and it was Clause 44, page 41. 1,400 families who would go to work on Monday without knowing that Friday night had mattered to them at all, and she picked up the pin, held it in her palm for one breath, straightened, and she spoke. Not loudly. That was the first thing anyone listening would have noticed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform, and she used the register she'd grown up, hearing her father use in the recordings he sometimes showed her from UN sessions, the clean, precise, and formal German of professional interpretation, and the kind that took years of immersion to attempt without an accent finding its way in. And she said, Herr Spears, möchten Sie, und dass ich die Geschäftsleitung informiere, und dass Ihr Gespräch heute Abend vertraulich soll, und oder soll ich so tun, and als hätte ich nichts verstanden. And Mr. Spears, would you like me to inform management that your conversation tonight requires privacy, or would you prefer I continue, as though I haven't understood a word you've said? One sentence, one question mark, One breath, released carefully afterward, and the room didn't stop all at once. It stopped in stages. The way a sound dies in a large space, not sharp, but spreading, one pocket of silence, expanding into the next, until the whole room was holding the same breath. And the table directly to the right of table 6, a couple, in their late 60s, anniversary dinner. Halfway through their second course, the woman's fork paused on its way to her mouth. She didn't put it down, she just stopped. Then she looked at Spears. Then she looked at Adeze, and then she set the fork down very quietly, the way you set something down when you want to keep watching without being watched yourself. Her husband followed her gaze. The table behind them, 4 people, business dinner. All mid-conversation, the one facing table 6 caught it first and stopped talking. The other 3 registered the silence and stopped too. One by one, like candles going still so in the same draft, Aldrich Voss's smile was gone, not faded, gone, the way a light goes out, and the colleague who had been studying his menu looked up. The one who had been looking at his hands looked up, and Conrad Spears, 64 years old, a man who had walked into rooms his entire career and had them rearrange around him, sat with his hand stopped halfway to his wine glass. His fingers didn't complete the motion. He sat very still, and in that stillness, and something moved through his face that wasn't quite any single expression, but was the precursor to all of them, the rapid internal accounting of a man who has realized simultaneously that he has made an error and that it has been witnessed, and that there is no version of the next 30 seconds he can control. And Adeze waited. The picture rested against her hip. She was not hostile. She was not performing. She wasn't managing her face into something diplomatic or softened to make him comfortable. And she was simply standing there, and the way her father had stood in those recordings, present, precise, and finished with the sentence, and waiting for the answer. And Eleanor felt it from the host stand, not heard, felt, the pressure change that happens when a room that has been moving stops moving, and the specific quality of a silence that means something has happened and hasn't finished happening yet. She set down the reservation book. She looked across the dining room. She read table 6. Spears's stillness. Voss staring at his plate, and Adeze's posture picture at her hip, spine straight, face holding the expression of someone who has asked a fair question and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for a fair answer. Eleanor had been running this room for 30 years, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. She walked, not hurrying. You didn't hurry in the Harlow room. Hurrying announced itself and changed a space in ways that were hard to recover from. And she moved at the pace of someone who had decided where they were going and intended to arrive without making it a thing. Horace followed her. He always followed her when she moved like that, and 26 years had taught him to read the difference between Eleanor walking and Eleanor walking with intention. And he didn't know yet what had happened, but his face had already started going pale. Eleanor arrived at table 6's. She stood beside Adeze, not in front of her, beside her. And she placed one hand, and very lightly, and on Adeze's shoulder, not gripping, and not guiding, and just placing. And the way you mark a position on a map. She looked at Conrad Spears, and she said, in her ordinary voice, the one that had never needed volume to fill a room, "Mr. and Spears, I see you've met Adeze. Allow me to introduce her properly." The room was already quiet. It got more quiet. This is Adeze Wells, and she is fluent in German, French, Spanish, and Japanese. And she reads Arabic at a working level. She is the daughter of Ellis Wells, formerly senior interpreter at the United Nations Office of Interpretation in New York, where he served for 19 years. And she has been accepted to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, deferred for 2 years for personal reasons. And she has been a member of this staff for 2 years. She paused. In 2 years, she has not made a single error on this floor. Another pause, shorter, and since I can see you wondering, Mr. Spears, no, she does not look like she doesn't understand. She never has. And Conrad Spears stood up. The motion was deliberate, careful. The motion of a man making a choice about what the next moment would look like and choosing to make it count. And he stepped 1 foot back from the table. He bowed his head. Not deeply, not the bow of someone performing contrition for an audience. A real one. Head down, shoulders dropped, hands loose at his sides. He held it for 2 full seconds. In a silent room, 2 seconds is a long time, and he straightened. He looked at Adeze, and, he said, and, in English, and in a voice that had gone quieter than his ordinary register, and I owe you an apology. And what I said was wrong, and I'm sorry." Aldrich Voss was still sitting. He had not stood. He was looking at his plate with the focused attention of a man attempting to become two-dimensional. The two colleagues had risen with spears, and they'd stood beside him, neither speaking, and their silence was the silence of men who knew they should have said something earlier and had not, and were watching the cost of that arrive at the table. Adaze looked at Spears, and she held the look for just a moment. Then she gave a single nod. Small, real. "Thank you," she said. "Your water is here whenever you need it." She turned. She walked to the next table. The couple to the right of table 6 started it, and the woman, the one who had set her fork down, began clapping. Quietly. The restrained kind, the kind that happens in a space where you know you're not the main event. Her husband joined her, and then the 4-top behind them, then a 2-top near the window. The applause was small, a little embarrassed, even the genuine kind, from people who felt something and didn't have a better outlet for it, and 8, maybe 10 people tapping their palms together in a restaurant that had just held its breath. Eleanor raised one hand, once. The applause settled, and, "Thank you." And Eleanor said, "And," to the room, and in a tone that was warm and final at once, "And we're still serving dinner." The room exhaled, forks resumed, glasses were lifted, conversations restarted in the tentative way of conversations that know something has happened and aren't sure what the protocol is for continuing after it. And Horace was standing 2 feet behind Eleanor. He looked like a man who had arrived at a scene he had caused and was only now understanding the full dimensions of what he'd done. He said, very quietly, "Eleanor." Eleanor turned to look at him, and she wasn't angry. She was something more precise than angry. She looked at him the way you look at something you've owned for a long time and are seeing just now from a different angle. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." She walked back to the host stand, and service continued. The dining room emptied by 11. The last table, a 3-top that had lingered over dessert with the unhurried ease of people who had nowhere better to be settled their check at 11:19, and the busser started on the far side with the vacuum, and the kitchen ran its closing checks, and the percussion of a professional kitchen winding down, and sheet pans stacking, and lowboy doors closing, and the extractor fan finally going quiet. And Adaze was restocking the linen shelf in the back corridor, folding, stacking, the ordinary mechanics of end of shift. She heard Horace's footsteps before she saw him. She knew the sound of his walk by now purposeful, even slightly heavier on the right foot than the left, and he stopped in the doorway. "Mrs. O.C. would like you to know that Mr. Spears has requested a private conversation," he said. "He's asked if you're willing." Adaze kept folding. "Where?" "Table near the kitchen pass. He's already waiting." She finished the stack she was working on and set it on the shelf. "Tell him I'll be there in a minute." She stood in the small bathroom off the back corridor for 90 seconds, not panicking, not composing herself into something she wasn't, and just being still. Because the last 4 hours had required a great deal of not being still, and she had learned long ago that there was a cost to sustained performance that had to be paid somewhere private before you could be present somewhere public. And she looked at herself in the mirror, her uniform, her hair still holding, the apron gone, but the habit of the pocket still there. Her hand drifted to her hip once before she caught it, and she thought about what her father looked like the last time she'd seen him wear the pin. Then she went out, and Conrad Spears was sitting at table 18. The small 2-top near the kitchen pass where the light was softer, and the sounds from the kitchen came through as a low murmur rather than a din. He was not what she'd expected. Same man, same suit, same silver hair, but his posture had changed. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, which was probably not something Conrad Spears did at tables in his ordinary life, and it made him look less assembled, more like a person and less like a position. Eleanor had left 2 cups on the table. Coffee, still steaming. She was nowhere in the room. Adaze sat down across from him. He did something then that she noticed without reacting to, and he reached for the coffee cups and slid one to her first. Just that, the small gesture of giving someone else the first cup. Neither of them mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment, and he looked at his hands, at the cup, at the table between them. Then he said, "My father was a welder, sheet metal." 41 years at the same plant in Racine, Wisconsin, and he worked nights for the last 12 of them because nights paid 60 cents more an hour, and he had 3 kids in school. He picked up his cup, set it back down without drinking. I built my whole career on the idea that I was becoming someone he never got to be, and the kind of man other men made room for when he walked in, the kind of man who didn't have to stand outside in the cold waiting for the shift whistle. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down, and tonight I realized I became the kind of man my father spent 41 years making things for, without ever knowing his name, without ever thinking to ask. Adazes looked at him. She let the silence sit and didn't rush to fill it. Her father had taught her that what people said after a real silence was almost always more important than what they'd said before it. The first statement was prepared. What came after the silence was true, and then she said, "My father used to tell me to listen all the way to the end of the sentence, because people hide who they are in the part they think you won't hear." She held his gaze, "And I think tonight I heard the end of yours." Spears closed his eyes. He sat with them closed for what might have been 30 seconds. The kitchen murmur continued. The busser's vacuum hummed somewhere distant. A stack of plates settled somewhere behind the pass. And he opened his eyes. They were different. Not wet. Not performing grief. Just different the way eyes look, when something has moved through them and left a mark. He said, "What you mentioned earlier, and the contract, being present before I sign, yes." He leaned back slightly. The first time he'd moved since she sat down. "Cultural advisory role," he said. "Language and contracts, based in Chicago, travel as needed, and you'd review acquisition documents in both languages, sit in on negotiations, identify the gaps between what we sign in English and what gets presented to our German-speaking financing partners." Among other things, she waited, 6 figures. Contract terms we negotiate together, and she looked at her coffee cup, picked it up, took one sip, set it back down. "You have a signing tomorrow morning," she said. "Daltrey Manufacturing. The deal closes at 10. He looked at her steadily. "Let me be in that room before anyone picks up a pen. Then I'll give you my answer." "And?" "Why? Because there's a clause in the German language version of the acquisition agreement that isn't in the English version. I read it 2 nights ago, and I'd like to read it again in the room before it becomes legally binding." And Conrad Spears looked at her for a long moment. The kind of moment where a calculation is being made, except the numbers involved aren't numbers. "How did you find it?" "Public filing database. And the Kellner acquisition 3 years ago used the same clause structure, same legal phrasing, same author based on the revision metadata. I recognized it when I saw it again." He was very still. "What does it say?" She told him. She told him plainly. No cushioning, no legal hedging, and just what the clause said and what it meant, and how many people it affected, and why it wasn't in the document his English-speaking counterpart was preparing to sign in the morning. As she spoke, she watched his face. She was good at reading faces, and had been since she was 9 years old, and her father had made a game of it, pointing at strangers and asking her what she thought was happening behind their eyes. What she saw now on Conrad Spears's face was not the calculation she'd half expected, and not the defensive rearranging, not the reaching for explanations. It was something simpler and harder, recognition. He knew, she thought, maybe not the specific clause, but he knew the category of thing it was, and he had built a career in acquisitions, and he knew the spaces where things like Clause 44 lived, and he had either looked away from those spaces or let other people manage them while he stood in a different part of the building. And he knew that, she knew that, and the silence between them held that understanding without either of them having to say it. Then he said, quietly, "Who else knows about this clause?" "No one on the Daltrey side. I found it in the German version. They've been reviewing the English version." He nodded once, and then he said, "Come to the signing. Be there." She nodded. He stood, straightened his jacket, looked around the empty dining room the way people look at spaces they're about to leave, taking in the specifics, as though they want to remember the shape of the moment. And then he looked at the pin in her apron pocket. She'd put it back after the confrontation at table 6. His eyes moved to it the way eyes move to something they half recognized, drawn but uncertain. "Your father's?" he asked. She took it out, showed him, the gold, and the olive branch shape, the small weight of it in her palm. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. "He was a builder of bridges," he said. "Not a question." And pause. "So are you?" He walked to the door. She heard his footsteps cross the floor, the front door open and close, and then nothing but the kitchen sounds. She sat at table 18 for a long time after he left. The coffee went cold. She didn't drink the rest of it, and she sat in the empty dining room of the restaurant that had assigned her water service and pre-busing and a name at the bottom of a list, and then she thought about 1,400 people who would get up tomorrow morning and go about their lives not knowing that tonight had mattered to them. And she thought about her father sitting behind glass in rooms where important things were being decided, making himself invisible so the words could get where they needed to go. She thought about a clause on page 41, and she thought about a welder in Racine who worked nights for 60 cents more an hour. She thought about a letter in her wallet, folded into eighths, going soft at the creases. Tomorrow morning, room on the 32nd floor, and she didn't know yet exactly what she was going to do when she got there. And she knew what she'd found. She knew what it meant. She knew she was going to read it aloud in front of both parties before anyone picked up a pen. What happened after that was not something she could control. But she had stopped trying to only do the things she could control, and that, maybe, was what tonight had actually been about. She picked up her bag. She turned off the light at table 18, and she walked through the empty dining room, past the tables she'd cleared 100 times, past the bar where Horace had stood with his jaw locked, and past the host stand where Eleanor kept the reservation book with the small handwriting, and she pushed open the back door into the alley. And Chicago, November, cold in the direct, honest way of a city that doesn't bother softening the news. She pulled her coat tighter. She walked to the bus stop, and she got on the 12 and 15 southbound, and sat in the window seat and watched the city go past in its late-night pieces the still-open laundromat, and the gas station, and the long blocks of buildings with lives lit up behind the windows. And she put her hand in her coat pocket. The pin was there, and she'd moved it from the apron before she left, tucked it into her coat pocket where she could feel it without having to reach. She didn't take it out, just felt it there, the small solid weight of it, the shape she knew as well as her own fingerprints, and she thought about the woman her father had been. About the bridge, not the river, not the shore. She thought, tomorrow I walk onto a bridge I didn't build. And then, that's what bridges are for. And the bus moved south through the city. She watched it go past. She let herself be carried. The building was on the 32nd floor. And Azaze had looked this up the night before, and along with the lobby procedure, and the elevator bank configuration, and the name of the administrative assistant listed on Spears International's Chicago office page. And because knowing a room before you walked into it was the difference between arriving and appearing, and she had not come this far to merely arrive. And Eleanor had given her the blazer at 6 in the morning, black, good fabric, the kind of jacket bought to be worn at the right moment and kept waiting patiently for it. And Eleanor had come in before the kitchen staff, which was earlier than early, and she'd had the blazer folded over her arm when a DZ walked through the service entrance. She handed it over without explanation. A DZ took it without asking for one. And that was the thing about Eleanor Osei, and she never made a production of the things that mattered. A daisy changed in the back room, hung her coat on the hook, stood in the blazer for a moment in front of the narrow mirror by the supply cabinet. She put her hand in the blazer pocket, and then remembered the pin was in her coat. And she went back, and took it out, and held it for a second, and then put it in the blazer pocket instead. And she took the elevator up, and the conference room was northeast corner, 32nd floor, with windows that ran floor to ceiling on two sides and a view of the city that, on a clear morning like this one, made Chicago look like something that had been planned rather than accumulated. And black walnut table, single slab, 14 feet long, coffee in glass carafes that no one was drinking. Pastries on a tray arranged with the careful attention of someone who understood that untouched food at a business meeting was part of the atmosphere, not a failure of catering, and the contract sat in 2 stacks at the center of the table. English on the left, German on the right. Raymond Daltrey was already seated when Adaze arrived with Spears, 68 years old, and Indiana. The kind of man who wore his history on his face without being aware of it, the lines that came from years of being outside, hands that had done physical work, at some point even if they'd moved on from it, and the settled stillness of someone who had built something real over a long time, and was now sitting across from a stranger who had decided to buy it, and he had 5 people with him, and 4 lawyers and 1 woman who turned out to be his executive assistant of 22 years. Cassandra sat to his right and had a yellow legal pad and the air of someone who had been in more of these rooms than anyone else at the table and was not impressed by any of them. And the lead attorney on Raymond's side was a woman named Patricia Keene, sharp-featured, running on what was clearly not her first coffee of the morning. And she looked up when Adeze walked in with Spears, and her gaze moved over Adeze once professional, assessing, the kind of look that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't going to offer anything for free either. Adeze had been assessed by Bedder and had poured their water, and she sat down at Spears's left. Raymond Daltrey looked at her with the polite uncertainty of a man who'd been told to expect a language consultant and was still determining what that meant in practice, and he didn't ask. The meeting was starting, and there wasn't time for introductions beyond the ones that had already been made. Adeze opened both contracts, placed them side by side, and began to read. The first hour was lawyers. She expected this, let it run, and the legal team on Spears's side, 3 of them, and practiced and efficient, walked through the acquisition structure, and the timeline, and the terms that had been negotiated over the preceding months. And Raymond's team listened, asked questions, flagged 2 items that got discussed, and resolved with the brisk pragmatism of people who had been doing this long enough to know which hills were worth standing on. And Adeze read. Her right hand held a pencil. Her left finger tracked down the German column, and her eye moved between the 2 versions the way her father had taught her, not translating word by word, and which was the beginner's error, but reading for meaning and for intent, and for the places where the architecture of one language allowed a thought to be built differently than the other language would build it. And she underlined 3 things in pencil, not 3 clauses. 3 specific phrases, the kind of language that was precise in German, and when rendered into English for a different audience, had been made soft and technically present, functionally invisible. The room moved around her. Coffee was refilled. A junior associate passed a note to the senior partner, and Raymond Daltrey asked about transition timelines for the Indiana facilities, and the conversation went back and forth for several minutes. Adeze kept reading. At 10:47, she put down her pencil. She looked at Spears. He saw it, and he had been waiting for it. She realized, glancing at her every few minutes with the peripheral attention of a man who had asked someone to do a specific job and was watching for the signal that the job was done. And he said, into a brief pause in the conversation around the timeline, Miss Wells, the room turned, 12 people, all of them looking at her. She didn't adjust her posture, didn't clear her throat, and didn't reach for any of the verbal cushioning that people used when they weren't sure whether what they were about to say was welcome. Mr. Daltrey, she said, and there is a clause in Article 44 of the German language version of this contract that does not appear in the English version, and I'd like to read it in both languages before any signature is offered. Patricia Keene put her pen down, not dropped, set down, with the deliberateness of someone whose hands need to be free for what comes next. Raymond Daltrey looked at Spears, not with anger, and the anger, if it was coming, wasn't here yet. And what was here was something older and more tired than anger. The expression of a man who had been in enough of these rooms to recognize the shape of a moment that should not be happening, and was bracing himself for the confirmation that it was happening anyway. And he said, "Conrad, did you know?" Spears said, "I know now." Adeze read Clause 44 aloud, German first, slow and clean, no interpretation yet, just the language given its full weight. The room was quiet in a way that rooms got quiet when something was about to change, and then English. And she translated the way her father had taught her to translate meaning for meaning, and with the precision of someone who understood that a contract clause wasn't just language, and it was intention, and the intention had to cross the gap intact. And the clause stated that within 18 months of the acquisition closing, and Spears International reserved the right to dissolve the existing pension obligations of all acquired Daltrey employees and replace them with a restructuring and efficiency package to be determined at corporate discretion. And 14 words in the German, 31 in English. Same meaning, different visibility, 1,400 families. The room held the silence of people doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to be doing, and Patricia Keene found page 41 of the German document and read it herself, and she read it twice. Then she set it down with the care of someone handling something that has just become evidence. She said, in a voice controlled at the outermost edge of her capacity, "When was this added?" Aldrich Voss had been quiet since the meeting started, and seated 2 chairs down from Spears on the right, in the careful position of a man who had arrived this morning, already knowing that the ground had shifted overnight, and had not yet determined how far. And he said, "The German version is the working document for our European financing partners. The language was standard across our acquisition templates. It wasn't intended to who approved it," Spears said. "Not a question. The punctuation was wrong for a question, and it was a statement with a name-shaped hole at the end." Voss stopped. Spears was not raising his voice. He was doing the opposite, and his voice had gone down from his ordinary speaking register quieter, in the way that authority sometimes went quiet when it had stopped needing to be loud. "And who approved the inclusion of Clause 44, he said. "Who approved its omission from the English version? Who made that decision and who signed off on it?" Voss opened his mouth, started to answer. "Reference precedent, reference the European financing structure, and reference something about how this was standard in cross-border acquisitions of this type, that the American counterpart was never intended to leave this meeting," Spears said. "We'll discuss your future this afternoon." Voss was quiet for a moment, and then he gathered his papers from the table in front of him. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with 2 small, precise movements, and he walked to the door without looking at anyone, which meant he looked at no one, including Adiese, which was its own kind of answer about what he understood had just happened. The door closed. The room sat with the silence he'd left behind. Raymond Daltrey had not moved, and he was sitting with his hands flat on the table, and looking at the space where Voss had been, and then at Spears, and then at nothing in particular. And he was 68 years old, and his grandfather had built the first Daltrey factory, and his father had built the second, and he had built the third, starting at 24 with borrowed money and a clear idea about what precision metalwork could be if you did it right. And 1,400 people went to work every morning because of those 3 buildings. He said, "Finally, Conrad, I came in here this morning ready to walk out before noon." Spears waited. "You just gave me a reason to stay," and Spears nodded once. "The clause will be removed from both versions," he said. "Pension obligations will be honored in full for the duration of each current employee's tenure at every Daltrey facility. No restructuring package, no corporate discretion." He looked at Adiese. "And I'd also like to add a section, a new one. I'd like Ms. Wells to draft it." Patricia Keene looked at Adiese, not with resistance, with the focused attention of a woman who had just recalibrated several things simultaneously and was now ready to work, and she slid a yellow legal pad across the table, blue pen on top of it. Adiese pulled the pad toward her. She thought for a moment, not a long one. She had been thinking about this in one form or another for 2 years, and about what it would mean to write down the things she knew to be true about how people treated the people who brought their food and cleaned their buildings and ran the machines in their factories, and about what it would look like to put those things in a contract, in legal language, in a document that had teeth and a signature at the bottom. She wrote, "Section 8. Worker dignity provisions, 9 paragraphs, 3 guarantees, and a living wage floor, a specific number, indexed to the cost of living in each facility's location, applied to every floor level and service tier and line level position across all acquired Daltrey sites. The right to be addressed by name, not a number, and not a position, not hey or you or nothing at all. The name on the badge or the name the person had asked to be called, whichever they preferred, used by supervisors, by management, by anyone in the organizational structure above them, and a written grievance process, formal, documented, and routed directly above the direct supervisor, so that the person most likely to be the problem was not also the only door to the solution." She wrote the English version first in clean, even strokes, and then on a second sheet she began the German translation for the parallel document, and working through it sentence by sentence, and checking her own phrasing against the surrounding contract language to make sure the register matched, that Section 8 would read as native to the document it was being added to, and not as something grafted on from outside. And the lawyers watched. and one of Spears's team young, and second year by the look of her, and pen already uncapped was taking notes on Adese's draft as it developed, and translating it in her head toward the formal legal language it would need to become. And Raymond Daltrey was reading over Adese's shoulder. Not loudly, just reading. His lips moved very slightly, the way people's lips moved when they wanted to make sure they understood something correctly. He said quietly, the name thing. Adese kept writing. Yes, and being called by name. Yes, whose idea was that? She finished the sentence she was on before she answered. My father's, she said, in a way. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Good idea, he said. The lawyers took the better part of 2 hours after that, and they took Section 8 and translated it into formal acquisition language, added a compliance mechanism, attached a reporting requirement and an annual audit provision. And Patricia Keene redlined 4 additional items she had not previously been permitted to redline, and went through them with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opening. Clause 44 was struck from both versions in front of both principals, and the English document was amended in 3 additional places where the German version had diverged in ways that were smaller than 44, but pointed in the same direction, and the room worked. And not the way rooms worked when they were performing productivity for each other, but the way rooms worked when something real had gone wrong, and there was an actual problem to fix, and everyone present understood that fixing it was more important than any of the other dynamics that had been operating an hour ago. And at 1:48 in the afternoon, both parties signed. Raymond Daltrey signed his name in the same plain block capitals he'd probably been using since he learned to write, and he signed each page without ceremony, passed the pen to his attorney, and when everything was done, he stood up and shook Conrad Spears's hand with both of his. Then he turned to Adese, and he looked at her, the way people looked at someone they'd been trying to place for an hour, and had finally placed, and the answer was nowhere near where they'd been looking. Young lady, he said, where do you work? Spears answered before she could, and until last night, he said, she was on water service at the Harlow room, and as of this morning, she is whatever she chooses to be. Raymond Daltrey stared, then he laughed, and a single full laugh, the first one of the day, the only one of the day, the kind that happens when something surprises you cleanly and completely, and there's nothing to do but let it out. I'll be damned, he said. He shook Adese's hand, and both of his hands around hers, the handshake of a man from a place where that meant something. And the meeting broke up with the particular organized energy of a room full of lawyers who now had a great deal of work to do. People gathered papers. Conversation started. The junior associate who had been taking notes was already on her phone, and Adese closed both versions of the contract, stacked them, set the pencil on top. She picked up her bag. The hallway was empty when she got there, and she stood by the elevator bank and pressed the button and listened to it coming, the soft mechanical sound of the cable, the number changing on the display above the doors. And she took her phone out, called her mother. Yvonne picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd come home from her night shift and hadn't been able to sleep. She did that sometimes when she was sitting with something she wasn't ready to put into words yet. Hey, Mama. Hey, baby. And everything okay? Yeah. She watched the elevator number change. I'm coming home for dinner tonight. Cook for me? The pause that followed lasted about 10 seconds, and it was the silence of a woman who had been waiting for something she couldn't have named and had just heard a version of it arrive. And I'll cook, Yvonne said. I'll make 2 plates. The elevator arrived. Adese got in. See you tonight. She rode down 32 floors watching the numbers change. She walked out into the cold afternoon, November, and direct and honest, the way Chicago cold tended to be, not theatrical, just factual. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She put her hand in her blazer pocket. The pin was there. She held it without taking it out. Then she walked to the bus stop, and 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, Eleanor Osei closed the Harlow room to the public. She had done this exactly twice in the restaurant's 30-year history. The first time was the night her husband died. The second time was this, and she'd had the room reconfigured that morning. 3 tables pulled together, covered with the special occasion linen she kept in the back of the supply cabinet. The candles were the good ones. The wine was from the cellar's shelf that didn't appear on the regular menu. And 12 people. 1 round table. Conrad Spears and his wife, Miriam, who turned out to be a quiet woman with a dry sense of humor and the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Raymond Daltrey and his wife, Carol, who had driven up from Indiana and arrived early and immediately helped Eleanor move one of the chairs because it was at an angle that bothered her, and Daniel Marsh, and president of the Daltrey Workers' Union, and then two of his shop stewards, all three of them in their best suits and worn with the careful respect of men who dressed up for the things that counted and meant every button of it. And they had driven 4 hours, and they were not going to pretend this was an ordinary Saturday night. And Adele Marsh, and the sommelier, and 22 years at the Harlow Room, and sitting at a table in the dining room, she had served for the first time as a guest, and she kept reaching for her wine key out of habit and catching herself. Eleanor herself, Yvonne Wells in the blue dress, and at Adaise's request, placed specifically on the list by Adaise herself, Horace Fitch, and Horace arrived early. He came through the front door in a dark suit that fit well. He had always dressed carefully. It was part of the self he had constructed, and he was carrying a small bunch of white flowers wrapped in brown paper. Not showy flowers, and the kind that said, "I thought about what to bring, and I chose deliberately." He found Adaise at the bar, checking the place settings the way she always checked place settings, because 2 years of muscle memory didn't stop for a special occasion. And he held out the flowers. He said, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong because I was scared. I'm sorry." Just that. No explanation of what had scared him, and no account of 26 years and the pride he'd built inside them, and what it had felt like to watch someone with 2 years make those 26 look like they'd been organized around the wrong thing. No request for those years to count in the reckoning, and no negotiation about what his fear entitled him to. And he said he was wrong. He said why in one word, and he stopped. Adaise took the flowers. She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of moment where the air between two people has a weight to it and both of them can feel it, and neither is pretending otherwise. And he stood there and let himself be looked at, which was probably the harder part. "Thank you, Horace," she said. "I'd like you to stay tonight as my guest." And something moved through Horace Fitch's face that he didn't try to manage or redirect or convert into something more composed. He turned away slightly. One hand came up. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and held them there for 2 seconds. And when he turned back, his eyes were clear. "Yes," he said, "thank you." Eleanor stood at the head of the table 20 minutes later, and she held a glass of champagne, the bottle she'd been given 8 years ago by a supplier who'd said save it for when it matters, a bottle she had moved from shelf to shelf and occasion to occasion for 8 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, and she did not give a speech. Eleanor had never believed that the size of an occasion required the size of the words used to describe it. She had always believed the opposite. She lifted her glass. "To Adaise Wells," she said, and who reminded an entire room that dignity speaks every language, and to all of us who needed the reminder. The table raised their glasses. Adaise sat very still. She looked around the table, the candles, the white linen, and the faces Spears and Miriam, Raymond and Carol, the union men who had driven 4 hours and were looking at the room with the appreciative attention of people who didn't often eat in places like this, and weren't going to let that make them feel out of place, and Adele with her hand hovering near her jacket pocket, where the wine key wasn't, and Eleanor, still standing, and glass in hand, and watching everything with the expression she always had present, knowing and missing nothing. And Horace, at the end of the table, holding his glass with both hands and looking at it rather than anyone else, which was fine. He was here. That was what she'd asked for. Her mother. And Yvonne Wells was looking at her, the way mothers looked at their children when they thought the child wasn't looking back. And Adaise looked back. Yvonne smiled. Small, the real kind. Then Yvonne stood up. She was not a woman given to standing at tables, and she had spent 30 years in a profession that required her to be fully present in rooms that were entirely about other people. And she had long since stopped needing attention to feel solid in herself. And she was wearing the blue dress, the one from Ellis's retirement ceremony, from Adaise's college graduation, the one that went back to the dry cleaner after each wearing and returned to the back of the closet in its bag. And she walked around the table slowly, taking her time until she was standing beside her daughter. She set a small wooden box on the linen in front of a daisy. She said, "Your father gave you this pin when you were 17. The table went quiet, and you pawned it twice during his illness. I bought it back twice. He knew. He knew the whole time, and he didn't say anything about it, because he understood why you'd done it, and he didn't want you to feel the weight of that on top of everything else." And she stopped for a moment. "And he told me. And last week he said, and when it's time, Yvonne, and pin it on her, and not in her pocket, on her, where the world has to look at it." She opened the box. The gold olive branch pins sat on a small square of dark velvet. Her hands were not steady, and they hadn't been quite steady since Ellis died, a slight tremor, always present, the body's record of what it had been asked to carry, and she picked up the pin carefully. She found the lapel of Eleanor's blazer, the one Adaeze had borrowed, perhaps for the last time, and she pinned the olive branch above the left breast pocket, above the heart. Adaeze put her hand over her mouth, and she made a decision somewhere, below conscious thought, not to cry right now. Not because she was holding herself together for the room, but because she wanted to be fully present for the rest of the evening, and she knew from experience that if she started, she would not stop easily, and there was more of tonight left, and she wanted all of it. And she took her mother's hand from her lapel and held it. Yvonne covered their joined hands with her other hand. They stayed like that. Nobody spoke. Conrad Spears stood. He said he had 3 things to tell the table, and he would be brief. First, a fellowship, and the Ellis Wells Fellowship for Language and Interpretation, funded by Spears International, named for Adaeze's father. 12 recipients per year. First-generation Americans pursuing linguistics, international affairs, or professional interpretation at the graduate level, and full tuition, 3 years of mentorship, and a guaranteed internship rotation through the United Nations Office of Interpretation in New York, the same office where Ellis Wells served for 19 years. The first cohort would begin in the fall, and Daniel Marsh raised his glass from his end of the table. His 2 shop stewards raised theirs. Second, a policy, the Harlow Standard, and the worker dignity provisions Adaeze had drafted on a yellow legal pad on a Saturday morning, and now formalized as a standing policy applied across all Spears International facilities in the United States, and in recommended, not required, and recommended, and with the understanding that recommended from Conrad Spears carried its own weight to every partner company in every acquisition going forward. And Raymond Daltrey nodded. Once, the kind that finished a sentence. Third, an offer, and the same offer made 3 weeks ago, and made again now, and in front of everyone at this table, and on terms that Adaeze had negotiated herself, because he had asked her to and she had, and part-time cultural advisory contract with Spears International. Flexible schedule, travel as needed, 6-figure base retainer reviewed annually, and a guaranteed place in the Middlebury Institute's conference interpretation program, beginning in the fall, with tuition paid by the fellowship that bore her father's name. And she would not have to choose between her education and her family. She would not have to choose between the paycheck and the program. She would not have to keep the letter folded into 8ths in the slot behind her library card. He sat down. Adaeze looked at her mother, and Yvonne was looking back. Between them, wordless, something passed that had been waiting a long time to pass. Then Adaeze looked at Spears. "I'll take it," she said, "on one condition," and he tilted his head. "I finish my last shift at Harlow, and I train my replacement myself." Eleanor's eyes were bright in the candlelight. She pressed her lips together for a moment before she could speak. "Of course, dear," she said. "Of course." The dinner went long, and no one was in a hurry. Raymond Daltrey told a story about his grandfather pouring the concrete for the first factory floor, with equipment that kept breaking down, and a foreman who kept saying it'll hold, and a workforce that kept showing up anyway. And Daniel Marsh laughed until he had to set down his fork. And Carol Daltrey told a shorter, better version of the same story that her husband hadn't known she knew, and Raymond looked at her with the expression of a man who had been married a long time and was still occasionally surprised by what that meant. And Adele opened a second bottle and talked about wine the way she never got to outside of work, not technically, but personally. About what she loved about it, which turned out to be something she'd never said out loud in 22 years of explaining it to other people, and Miriam Spears, and who had been quiet for much of the evening, in the way of people who were listening rather than waiting to speak, and said something to Adeze at one point that made Adeze laugh a real laugh, and sudden and genuine, and the kind that surprised her into it. And Hafez sat at his end of the table. He was mostly quiet, but he was there. And at some point, during the later part of the evening, Adeze noticed that the tension had gone out of his shoulders. And, not entirely, not permanently, some things you carried for a long time, before you could set them down, and some things you never fully set down at all. But for this night, at this table, he had loosened something he'd been holding. That was enough, and the following Saturday came clear and cold. Adeze arrived at the Harlow room at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before service. Tessa Brown was already there, 22 years old, South Side, and 2 kids, a 4-year-old and an 18-month-old, both with her mother during her shifts. And she'd never worked fine dining before, and she was trying not to let that show, which meant she was holding her body with the careful stiffness of someone who wasn't sure where anything went, and had decided that stillness was safer than motion until she knew. And Eleanor had hired her 5 days ago. Adeze had met her once, briefly, to tell her she'd be training her. Tessa had nodded with the concentrated attention of someone who was already storing information, and they stood in the dining room, just the two of them, and the empty tables, and the flat winter light coming through the west windows. Adeze said, "Okay, let's start with the floor." She showed her everything, the layout, and the supply closets, and what was in each one, and why that organization mattered when you were in the middle of a full service and needed something in 30 seconds. The silver drawer and the system looked arbitrary and wasn't, and the specific lean of table 3 and table 11 level on one side and not quite on the other, which mattered when you were setting down anything liquid. The kitchen pass and how to read the expediter without asking questions during a rush, and the wine room and the organizational logic that Adele had built over 22 years and would explain personally once Tessa was ready for it. But also the other things, and how to read a table in the first 30 seconds of approach, the body language that told you whether people wanted to be left alone or needed something and weren't going to ask for it, and how to move through a room at full capacity without creating disruption, how to absorb a difficult guest without absorbing what they were trying to give you, how to correct a service error so smoothly that the correction didn't register as a correction, and how to be exactly as vivid as the moment required. Not more, not less. Tessa listened with the focused full-body attention of someone who understood that what she was receiving was worth receiving carefully. She asked questions, and not many, but the right ones, the kind that showed she was processing rather than just collecting, that she was already thinking about application rather than storage. And by the time service started at 7, and she was ready in the way that first nights were ready, imperfect, and uncertain in the specific places that experience would eventually fix, and but present and paying attention and not going to be undone by what she didn't know yet. And Adeze worked her section for the last time, and she didn't perform the significance of it. Didn't let herself hover in any particular moment, trying to press it into memory. And she just did the work, and completely, and the way she always had, and because that was the only way she knew how to do it, and because the work deserved to be done right, even when it was the last time. But she noticed things, the weight of the linen in her hands, the way the light hit the glassware at table 4 during the rush, when everything was moving at once, and the sound of Adele's voice from the wine room, warm and certain, Eleanor at the host stand watching everything, saying almost nothing, and the particular feeling of a room running well, not flashy, not dramatic, just the quiet satisfaction of a complicated thing, working the way it was supposed to work, because the people inside it were doing their jobs and doing them right. She had spent 2 years being part of that, and she would carry it with her. At 10:45, the last table cleared, and Tessa was helping the busser on the far side, and Adeze watched her for a moment the way she'd already started to adapt her pace to the room's rhythm without being told to, and the small adjustments accumulating into something that would, and with time, and become fluency, and she would be good at this, maybe more than good. Adeze took off her apron. She folded it the way she'd folded it after every shift for 2 years, lengthwise first, then in thirds, the fold lines always landing in the same places because repetition built its own muscle memory, and the fabric was soft at the tie strings from washing. There was a small bleach mark near the left pocket from an incident in month 3 that she'd stopped noticing somewhere around month 6. She held it for a moment. Then she walked to where Tessa was standing. "Here," she said, and then held it out. Tessa took it, looked at Adize. "I can't take your 3 rules," Adize said. Tessa went quiet. Adize said, "Listen all the way to the end of the sentence, and people hide who they are in the part they think you won't hear." Tessa nodded. "Pour the water before you take the order." "Not because of the water." Tessa waited. "Because it says, 'I see you,' before you've told me what you need, and before you've asked nicely or explained yourself or done anything to earn it, just to see you. That's all it says." But that's not a small thing. Tessa was very still and never decide who someone is before they've spoken, and Adize reached into the pocket of the apron she'd just handed over. The pin was there. She'd put it there before the shift started, moved it from the blazer to the apron pocket, back where it had lived for 2 years, because it belonged there for this last night. She took it out, and she looked at it. The gold, the olive branch, the small weight of it in her palm, which was not the weight of the metal, but everything else the metal had absorbed over 11 years on her father's lapel and 2 years in her pocket, and she pinned it to the apron, above the left pocket, above where the heart would be. "This belonged to my father," she said. "He gave it to me. I'm giving it to you." Tessa started shaking her head. Adize held her hand. "When you find the person who needs it next," she said, "you'll know. Pass it on then. That's all." Tessa looked at the pin on the apron in her hands. Her eyes were bright, and she didn't try to make them less so, and Adize hugged her. Real, brief, the hug of one person handing something important to another and trusting them with it. Then she picked up her bag. She said goodnight to the busser, who raised a hand without turning around, and she said goodnight to the line cook wiping down the pass. She stopped at the wine room and found Adele capping bottles. Adele looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would be proud of you. I want you to know that." And Adize nodded. That was enough. It was more than enough. She found Eleanor at the host stand. The older woman was writing in the ledger, the small handwriting, the column of notes that had included Adize's name 3 times. She looked up, she put the pen down, and she opened her arms. Adize stepped into them. And Eleanor was smaller than she seemed when you were working for her, close up, and the difference in height was real. And the smell of her perfume was warm and simple, and something she'd worn for years without changing it. And her embrace was the embrace of a woman who had learned over a long time that holding on and letting go were not opposites but 2 expressions of the same thing. They stayed like that for a moment. "Go," Eleanor said. Adize stepped back. She nodded, and she walked through the Harlow room for the last time as an employee, past the tables, past the bar, past the host, stand where the reservation book sat open to tomorrow's page, and she pushed open the front door. And Chicago, November, cold in the direct way of a city that didn't soften its weather for anyone. The street was quiet, a cab going past, 2 people walking quickly with their heads down, and a light in the apartment above the dry cleaner across the street, someone's evening visible through the window. Adize stood on the sidewalk. She breathed. The pin was not in her pocket. For the first time in 2 years, the pin was not in her pocket. And something else was gone too, not the pin. And something didn't have a name exactly. And the particular weight of a decision made at 21 that had been sitting against her sternum ever since it. And the weight of the life she'd set aside, and the question of whether she'd set it aside permanently or just for now. And the daily low-grade arithmetic of that uncertainty. And gone, not resolved into certainty, just gone, released. Set down somewhere back in that room, she breathed again. She sat on the bench and looked at the street and watched a woman across the way walking a dog and laughing at something on her phone. And an ordinary Friday night, an ordinary city doing ordinary things. She took her wallet out, found the slot behind the library card. The letter was there. She took it out and unfolded it all the way for the first time in months. Read the first line. "We are pleased to offer you admission." She folded it back. Not into eighths, into quarters. She put it in the front slot of her wallet, the one where you kept things you were going to need. The bus came, and she got on. Window seat, Chicago outside, going past. The laundromat still open, the gas station, the long residential blocks with their lit windows and their ordinary lives moving behind the glass, and she put her hand in her coat pocket. Nothing there. She left it there anyway, palm open. Just feeling the fabric, the warmth, the simple fact of her own hand in her own pocket on a bus going home. And her father had sat in rooms behind glass and given his voice to words that needed to travel from one mind to another without losing anything on the way. He had done it for 19 years. He had called it the bridge. And she thought, I know what the bridge feels like now. Not from the outside, from the inside, from being the bridge. She thought, that's what he wanted me to know. The bus moved south through Chicago. She watched the city. She let herself be carried. And 8 months later, the following things were true. Adese Wells was halfway through her first full year at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and she lived in a small apartment with 2 other graduate students, one pursuing Mandarin interpretation and one pursuing Arabic, which made their kitchen table conversations genuinely unlike any conversations happening in most other kitchens. And she studied in the mornings. And 3 afternoons a week, she worked remotely as a cultural and language advisor for Spears International and reviewing acquisition documents, and sitting in on negotiations, and doing the actual work of finding the gaps between what was written in one language and what was understood in another. And in April, she had given a 12-minute talk at a United Nations Youth Forum in New York on labor protections in cross-border acquisitions. She had not made it less technical to make it more accessible, and she had trusted her audience to be capable of the real version. 400,000 people had watched it by the end of the week. Yvonne Wells had cut her hospital hours to 36 a week, and on Sunday mornings she went to a bookshop in her neighborhood and sat in the back corner with coffee and read for 2 hours without answering her phone. She had not done that in 20 years. And now she did it every Sunday, and came home in a different quality of mood than she'd left in. And Eleanor Osei had hired 6 new servers in the year since Adese left. 4 were first-generation Americans. 1 was a woman who had arrived in Chicago from West Africa at 32 with a degree in economics and a language the American job market hadn't found a use for yet, and Eleanor had found a use for her. The Harlow Room's reservation list was the longest it had been in a decade. Horace Fitch was still the maitre d'. He had the 3 rules on a laminated card in his jacket pocket, and he had printed them himself, laminated them himself at the office supply store on the corner. He showed the card to new staff during their first week. He did not explain where the rules had come from. He did not need to, and people who asked him directly got told the truth, and he told it without embarrassment, which was new for Horace, and which the people he told seemed to understand was not a small thing. Conrad Spears called Adese once a quarter, and not about language, about listening, about what it meant to build organizations around the actual human beings inside them, rather than the efficiency those human beings were supposed to produce. She answered honestly. He listened, and the Harlow Standard had been implemented at all Spears International facilities. Raymond Daltrey had adopted it at all 3 Daltrey manufacturing sites before the acquisition even finalized. And Daniel Marsh had it framed on the wall of the Union Hall in Indiana, next to a photograph of the original factory floor from 1962. And Tessa Brown was still at the Harlow Room. She wore the pin on her apron every shift, above the left pocket, above where her heart was. She had been promoted to lead server in March. And she had already passed the 3 rules to 2 other women in her section, younger, newer, and still learning to read a room, and she had passed them the way Adese had passed them to her. And not as a list, but as a way of being present in a space that other people thought they owned. And the pin had not moved yet. But Tessa knew the weight of it. She knew what it meant to carry something that was meant, eventually, to be given away. She knew that the carrying was not the point. The giving was the point. And then somewhere in the city on any given night on a bus, and window seat, and city going past in pieces, a young woman was doing a job that nobody was watching, and doing it right anyway. Carrying something no one had asked about yet, paying attention, listening all the way to the end.